As West entered his automobile parked in downtown Denver, Smaldone enforcers Frank Mazza, Porky Rauda, and Paul Enrici, who long had been known as bodyguards and strong-arm men for the Smaldones, accosted West, forced him into the automobile, and ordered him to drive out onto the Pecos Road outside of Denver. An informant years later related that undoubtedly these men intended to kill West, but the latter jumped out of the automobile as it was proceeding through downtown Denver streets, started screaming, and raised such a commotion that his assailants fled the scene. A few days after this incident, Colasaco went to talk things over with the Smaldones in their office at Gaetano's restaurant, and there Clyde and Eugene Smaldone told him if he and his partner desired to continue their gambling activities at Priola's farm, it would be necessary henceforth to pay the Smaldones 50% of the gambling proceeds.
The legends of the American Mafia are woven into the fabric of American society and pop culture. We've all seen the movies or heard the stories of the men of this secret society. They are stories of family, power, wealth, respect, greed, betrayal, violence, murder, and mayhem. While the golden age of the mob may be over, the stories have become lore, and the names remain as infamous as ever. You're listening to the Members Only Podcast, hosted by history buff and mob aficionado Jacob Stoops. He tells the true crime biographies of real-life mobsters and dives deep into the plots, subplots, and real facts behind Cosa Nostra, as well as popular mob films and television shows. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Members Only Podcast. I am your host, Jacob Stoops, and I'm a mob enthusiast and historian. In part one of this two-part series on the Colorado Mafia, we laid out how the organization that would later become known as the Smaldone crime family, which ran organized crime in Denver and much of Colorado during the 20th century, came to be. We covered several major events, including early Italian immigration to Colorado, how Prohibition contributed to the rise of the mobs, the story of the Carlino brothers, Pete, Sam, and Charlie, the Carlinos' war with the Dana family, their own kin, the Bootleggers Convention in Denver in 1931, and the following and subsequent murders of Pete and Sam Carlino, followed by the rise and fall of Giuseppe Joe Roma. Today we're going to dig into the era of the Smaldone brothers, which of course comes right after the fall of Joe Roma. My hope is to cover most of the history behind this family, which ran most of the rackets in and around Denver, Colorado throughout the 1930s through the 1980s. We're also going to touch on their connection to the Mafia in Pueblo, Colorado, and discuss some of the players in that family as well. Now, I can't quite pinpoint why I've been just so specifically fascinated by the Smaldone brothers, but as you'll see, their story is pretty epic, and I think you're going to see that similar to the last episode, that there was just as much going on with organized crime in Colorado as with other areas of the country, and it was covered locally. It just didn't get the publicity nationally, nor did it have the prestige of the East Coast mob. And as a reminder, before we get into the episode, if you're watching on YouTube, I'd just like to ask you to please smash that subscribe button and turn on the bell to get notifications when I release a new episode. Also, if you're listening to the audio-only version, subscribe, and if you're willing to leave me a rating or a review to tell me what you think of my content, I'd be much obliged. All right, now let's continue and finish our story, part 2 of the history of the Colorado mob. We're going to pick up where we left off in part 1. The date was February 18th, 1933, and the preeminent gang boss in the entire state of Colorado, Giuseppe Joe Roma, had just been assassinated. The diminutive 5'2" mobster known as Little Caesar was found slumped dead in a chair in his front parlor of his home on 3504 Vallejo Street in North Denver by his wife Nettie, riddled with 7 bullets, including 6 shots to the head. This underworld murder was just the latest in a series of tit-for-tat slayings that had been plaguing the Colorado area for at least a decade, dating back to the days of the Carlino-Dana family wars. After both the Carlinos and the Danas were wiped out, Giuseppe Joe Roma had filled the power vacuum and was the dominant mafiosi in most of Colorado from 1931, after having Sam and Pete Carlino, aka the Al Capone of Southern Colorado, whacked in the process, until meeting his own grisly demise in February of 1933. Now, it's important that you know the players, as the men who came next had ties into both groups at times during the 1920s and 1930s. Shortly after the assassination, police detained and questioned many suspects, including 2 brothers who were allegedly top lieutenants for Roma: Clyde, Flip-Flop as he would become later known by the media, Smaldone, and Eugene Checkers Smaldone. According to a report in the Fort Collins Coloradoan. Quote, the Smaldones, Spinelli, and Brinzi told Clark they visited Roma from 10 a.m. until afternoon Saturday in an effort to borrow money. They left shortly after noon and went to a motion picture house, they said, differing, however, on the house they attended, Clark said. They returned to the Roma home after word got around that Mrs. Roma had found her husband's body at 1:45 p.m. and then voluntarily went to police headquarters. Police Chief Clark said they showed ticket stubs indicating they entered the theater at 1:55 p.m. End quote. Though they were questioned and had an alibi, they were ultimately not charged in the assassination of Roma, and Roma's murderers were never actually brought to justice. As I mentioned in the first episode of this series, nobody really knows for sure except those involved who killed Roma, but it certainly looked very suspicious from a law enforcement perspective to be seen at the victim's house less than 2 hours before he was shot and killed. According to the book Smaldone, The Untold Story of an American Crime Family, written by Dick Kreck, Clyde Smaldone would say the following in a tape-recorded family interview some 60 years after the fact. Quote, somebody shot him in his house. The police thought we did it because we left the house about 2 hours before he got shot. Well, they knew we didn't do it, but somebody shot him. It don't bother me one way or another. The Pueblo mobs was always arguing and fighting amongst themselves about the business, and they weren't capable of handling business, to tell you the truth. They was all right making moonshine, but to sell it, they didn't have a diplomatic way of talking to people to get business. Most of them couldn't hardly talk English. End quote. The funeral, in which the Smaldones had contributed 2 of the most massive floral arrangements, which is, of course, gangster tradition, was attended by over 2,000 people. The whodunit notwithstanding, one thing was for certain after the murder. The death of Roma led to a significant vacuum in the Denver underworld that would be filled in time by the enterprising Smaldone brothers in partnership with their Southern Colorado allies in the Pueblo Mafia. Now let's step back out just for a second and give a brief background on the Smaldone brothers and just how they fit into the overall picture by the early 1930s. We'll begin with their parentage. Raphael Smaldone, the father of the Smaldone brothers, was born in Potenza, Italy in 1882, and at the age of 2 immigrated with his parents, Gaetano and Katrina, to the United States. The family would set up shop in Buffalo, New York, but by 1889, after 5 years living in Buffalo, decided to make a change and move the family across the country to the wide open spaces and mile-high air of Denver, Colorado. At the time, an economic boom had hit Colorado, which meant that there were plenty of jobs available for Italians if they were willing to accept the risk of taking on backbreaking and relatively dangerous occupations working for the railroads or in the mines. In 1901, Raphael, who by then had Americanized his name to Ralph, married Mamie Filiolino, and the couple would go on to have 11 children. The family lived in a small house on 3427 Osage Street in Denver, Colorado. Clyde would be the firstborn son in 1906, followed by 5 more sons: Eugene, born 1910, Anthony, born 1914, Andrew, born in 1917, Ralph, born in 1921, and Clarence, who we'll hear about later, born in 1924. Of course, they also had several sisters. Now, with many gangster stories, you'll typically find that the subjects involved come from broken homes, poverty, and often lack of father figure. That did not seem to be the case with the Smaldone family. Raphael landed a job as a laborer with the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad Company, making $30 per month. And when he became a foreman, his salary increased to $40 per month, which was a really good salary for the time and allowed him actually to replace the family's outhouse with an in-home toilet and a bathtub. Huge luxury at the time, especially for a large Italian family. Eventually, Raphael changed careers and took up work as a fruit and vegetable peddler. After pulling together enough money to buy a horse and a wagon, he began making deliveries all over town, including in the wealthier neighborhoods. And while the Smaldone family certainly was not destitute, they still had a lot of mouths to feed, and as was normal for the times, the boys would put in work to help support the family. As was expected in those days of firstborn sons, Clyde would labor with his father in the fruit and vegetable business. In time, he also got a job selling newspapers all over town, often from dusk until dawn, and he and his brothers would also find more creative ways to support the family. According to Clyde, he and his brother Eugene would hang out by the railroad hurling rocks at steam locomotive crews as they drove by. And when the crews responded by throwing chunks of coal, the boys would carry them home to help heat the house. Now, interesting way to heat the house, but hey, you got to do what you got to do. But the business of the Smaldone family would soon change, and Raphael, along with his sons, would find another means of making money: bootlegging. Now, as I covered at length in part 1, bootlegging would become a critical driving force in the development and advancement of the Mafia across the country. It was no different in Colorado, and in fact, Colorado even got a head start. The state would enact Prohibition and go dry in 1916, a full 3 years ahead of the Volstead Act, which was enacted nationally in 1919. And of course, history tells us that this was an immensely unpopular law that was difficult to enforce, and a still thirsty public got their fill of booze from bootleggers who had redirected and coalesced their organizations around producing and selling bootleg alcohol. Capitalizing on the opportunity, Raphael Ralph Smaldone would begin selling moonshine to speakeasies in Denver. His runners would be none other than his sons, Clyde and Checkers. Clyde, by that point, was entering his teens, and Eugene Checkers Smaldone was not far behind during the early days of Prohibition. And considering how competitive and volatile the Colorado underworld would be in the 1920s, anyone who chose this as a profession did so at risk of great personal harm and even death. But as an Italian family, it was only natural to rely on your sons, and the money to be made was significant even with the obvious risks involved. The boys, especially Clyde, had a natural entrepreneurial spirit and didn't mind taking risks from time to time. According to an interview Clyde would give in later years, he and his friends would undercut other bootleggers by finding out where they hid their booze, stealing it, and selling it for a lower price. They would scout their rivals to find out where they kept their liquor, and when the opportunity was right, they'd swoop in. They were known to have ransacked many garages around North Denver in search of booze to sell. Despite the dangers, Clyde, an ever-ambitious and calculating businessman, soon found that the possibilities to make money in selling hooch were incredible and made the decision to start his own business, at first partnering with local hood Roxy Stone. Eventually, he'd move on from Roxy and brought in his brother Eugene as a partner once Checkers came of proper age. They took an office in Denver at 34th and Pecos and began selling whiskey, both making their own as well as importing and selling other brands. It wasn't long before the duo was making good money, so much so that they were able to help their parents out even more by buying toys for their siblings, clothes for their mother and father, and even helping to fix up the family house. Of course, they would run, from time to time up against issues with the police, but Clyde made a habit of paying off the right people or decorating the mahogany, as he would put it, to ensure that his business could continue to operate. Like many other bootleggers, the lessons and experiences gained from running their business during the 1920s would benefit them throughout their lives. Over time, Clyde realized that in order to make real money, he needed to focus on selling the good stuff, aka bonded whiskey, which patrons were willing to pay top price for. The brothers would start by running booze locally, but as time went on, would expand operations and would regularly be running liquor between Denver and several Midwest cities, including St. Louis, Kansas City, as well as Chicago. The brothers would even begin to venture as far as Canada in order to secure top-shelf bonded whiskey. As Clyde would relate in his later years, he'd make a lot of important connections during this time and even formed a partnership with the Capone mob in Chicago. In fact, many of the relationships built by key players in cities across the U.S. during the bootlegging years certainly played a significant part in why Cosa Nostra and the National Crime Syndicate was able to function so successfully and so broadly later on. The guys built the connections in the 1920s, and they lasted. He'd share the following about how that relationship got off the ground in an interview that was later recorded in the book that I'll be citing many times in this episode, Smaldone, The Untold Story of an American Crime Family. Quote, I went up to Chicago and got talking about getting the stuff up in Canada. They said, hell, we get a lot of stuff out of there too. Maybe we can work out something a little better. I told them how much I paid, $66 a case at the time, and he said, gee, I'm going to talk to Al about that. I told them where I could load it, where they could bring it across the Mississippi to Burlington, Iowa. He says, Al says to give it to you for $35 a case. We'll only charge you $2 a case for gasoline and other expenses. End quote. Canadian bonded whiskey would end up being such a success that the brothers would find themselves on the road for weeks at a time. Eventually, they'd become so busy that they'd bring their younger brother Anthony in on the business as well. Now, the business wasn't without its dangers. As I shared in part 1, Denver and Pueblo, Colorado in the 1920s was a veritable shooting gallery. The dominant players were the Carlino brothers, of course, but they had had many rivalries and went to war with their own kin in the Dana family for almost the entire decade. There were also other Italian groups, including the emergence of Giuseppe Joe Roma beginning in the mid-1920s, as well as Irish contingents butting heads and shooting it out as well. Law enforcement authorities would estimate that between 1919 and 1933, the beginning and end of national prohibition, there would be at least 30 murders relating to bootlegging and various gangster conflicts in the Denver and larger Colorado area. In fact, based on my research, I actually believe that this number is most likely not just understated, but very understated. If you look at their figure, 30 murders, that comes out to about 2 murders per year over the course of 14 years, which just seems unrealistically low based on even the murders that I reported on, but also those murders that go unmentioned, right? When you think about the level of conflict, the level of competition between the various groups in Denver and Pueblo, the number's got to be way higher than 30. So that's just me on my soapbox, suggesting that, even in my cursory research, it looked like it was more. So in that way, the action in Colorado during the 1920s parallels most of the other big cities at this time, which were almost nearly universally experiencing their own strife as well. And the Smaldones would certainly experience the peril of their chosen profession. Based on my research, there were indications that the Smaldone brothers had a close relationship at times with the Carlino brothers, and they would end up working either for or in close partnership with the Giuseppe Joe Roma organization as well in the early 1930s. There's almost no way to have existed in this organization without getting your hands dirty. And as we stated in part 1, it's pretty clear that Roma engineered the assassination of the Carlinos before he himself was killed. And so it's around this time in the 20s and early 30s that the Smaldone brothers begin regularly showing up in the police blotter, racking up many arrests between them. In 1920, at the tender age of 13, Clyde would be arrested on a burglary charge for stealing a pair of pants from a local hardware store, and he would talk about that many times in interviews that would be used. You can look it up on YouTube. There's interviews of him talking about this very thing, being picked up for stealing pants of all things. And it would certainly not be his last trip through the juvenile court system. Additional arrests for bootlegging, reckless driving, more burglaries, impersonation of police officers, receiving stolen goods, hijacking, and brawling would all follow. In 1927, Clyde and his Confederates were arrested for possession of several gallons of liquor, as well as hijacking 96 pints of whiskey from a competitor's truck. The Smaldones would continue to rack up arrests, and in 1932 they would be arrested several times, though no serious charges stuck. On March 13, 1932, Clyde and another brother, James Smaldone, would be arrested for an attempt to buy shotgun shells loaded with buckshot at a local pawn shop, which authorities believed was related to attempts on the lives of staff members of District Attorney Earl Wettingill. They would be charged with vagrancy. Later that year, on December 29, 1932, Clyde, Checkers, as well as associates Jim Spinelli and future Pueblo LCN boss Charlie Blanda were charged with carrying concealed weapons after a raid at Checkers' home unveiled a veritable arsenal that included 4 .35 caliber rifles, 2 sawed-off shotguns, and a Browning automatic rifle. Eugene Checkers Smaldone would be quoted by police as saying, quote, "Maybe I like to go hunting. I don't know anything about this gang stuff." End quote. And that brings us back to where we began this story in 1933, just after the assassination of Denver gang lord Joe Roma. This event, as we mentioned, would leave a huge power vacuum in the Colorado underworld, and the Smaldones would be the ones who would eventually fill it. The Smaldone brothers began their ascension to relative power after the murder of Joe Roma in 1933, but it wouldn't be immediate. In fact, the beginning of their era would start with a relative thud, as for the first time in their lives, they would spend significant time behind bars. Now, according to them, what happened was a frame-up by federal law enforcement, but the fact of the matter is that in 1933, their parents, Raphael and Mamie Smaldone, would be caught peddling alcohol out of their home in North Denver. According to Clyde, and despite his father's involvement in a barroom business, his parents were supposedly ignorant of prohibition laws, and in reality, he believed the Fed's true targets were himself, his brothers, and their associates. As a result, and to keep their parents out of jail, Clyde and Checkers struck a deal with the authorities, pleading guilty to violation of federal liquor laws in exchange for their parents' release from further prosecution. The judge in the case, Judge J. Foster Sims, would say the following, quote, "My only regret in this case is that the owners of the still didn't kill you all off. That would have saved the government the expense of bothering with you." End quote. The reference to the still was in relation to a recent gunfight in Florissant in which hijackers reputed to have been Clyde, Checkers, Charlie Blanda, and a few others were fired upon while stealing a large quantity of alcohol from a rival gang. One of the Smaldone brothers' associates, a young man named John Pacello, was killed in the gunfight, and all of the men had deep associations with Joe Roma. So it's clear that by this point, the Smaldones were in the crosshairs and had gained a fairly negative reputation from many in law enforcement, some of their own doing, and some by association with major underworld figures, despite regularly decorating the mahogany, so to speak. So in May of 1933, following their guilty pleas, Clyde and Checkers would be sentenced to serve 18 months in federal prison at Leavenworth, Kansas, and fined $1,000 apiece, which is roughly $22,000 in today's money. While this is all going on, the primary source of their income, that being bootlegging, went belly up as growing public sentiments against prohibition finally led the government to pass repeals of the Volstead Act in 1933, making alcohol production essentially legal again. This happens roughly 10 months after the Roma assassination. So by the time the brothers are released from prison, Prohibition is over, and like many bootleggers across the country, they'd be forced to look for a new way to make money. Clyde and Checkers would both be released in the following year, 1934. Now, before we go any further with the chronology of events, let's take a quick step back so we can provide you with a brief synopsis of who the brothers were so you can better understand the relationship between them and, of course, with other factions. First and foremost, I want to make sure that it's clear that the Smaldones, while gangsters for sure, were not Mafia, nor was their family an official Cosa Nostra family. This actually surprised me in my research as I went into these episodes thinking they were LCN, so it's just the latest example of me believing one thing and my research uncovering another. That's why we research. So, now that I'm done with my research, I think what I'd really say is that they were more along the lines of the Al Capone variety of mob, meaning that there were no inductions, no official titles, etc. Within declassified law enforcement documents, my research almost always referred to the Smaldones using the words suspected LCN rather than official LCN, which was used to describe some of their true Mafia associates. Though the Smaldones were allowed to essentially run Denver and had huge sway across the entire state, the real official Mafia was down in Pueblo. What's clear to me is that the Smaldones had formed close working partnerships with their counterparts in the Pueblo LCN, but it seems they were just never brought in, nor did they ever adopt the formal rules of Cosa Nostra. And you will see if you look up, for example, the Colorado mob and you get to Wikipedia, you're going to see lists of boss, underboss, certain years, and you're going to see the Smaldones and the Pueblo organization almost merge together when in fact they weren't one organization. They were two separate entities. Now, if someone disagrees, I'm willing to debate, but nothing in my documentation or research indicated that they ever became true LCN, though you'll see them reported as such, especially in the 1970s and 1980s. From what I can tell, the lines here were very much blurred, and the Smaldones certainly did hold true to some core values, such as keeping their mouths shut, which they did almost until the end of their lives, as well as operating in a lot of the same rackets as traditional Cosa Nostra families and even using the same tactics up to and including being allegedly involved in several murders throughout their time running the Denver underworld. Clyde Smaldone was the oldest brother and veritable leader of the Smaldone organization. By the time he got to the mid-1930s, he was in his late 20s, so still pretty young. Many will say that he was gifted with two distinct qualities. First, he had street smarts, which allowed him to navigate the 1920s and early 30s relatively unscathed. This is a tremendous feat considering how close he was to so many of the key players who themselves ended up violently murdered. Second, and this would serve him well during his time in organized crime, he was very adept at building relationships with important people due to his gentlemanly, affable, and outgoing personality. As a result, he made friends in high places, which would allow him to have significant influence with important businessmen, law enforcement, local civic leaders, and many high-end politicians, up to and including meeting and famously providing booze for none other than President Franklin D. Roosevelt during his 1931 Whistle Stop tour, and meeting later on Harry Truman before he became president when he was just getting started in Kansas City. Not that this last part is something to be proud of, but even he was able to get along with the local Ku Klux Klan, which had infiltrated nearly all levels of the government in Denver at the time. Similar to construction companies having to do business with the Mafia in New York City in the 70s and 80s in order to essentially get anything done, in Denver in the 1920s and 1930s, you pretty much had to deal with the unsavory figures of the KKK. It was just a fact of life at the time. Over the years, Clyde and his brothers would rub elbows and foster relationships with many key Cosa Nostra figures across the United States, including the likes of Carlos Marcello of New Orleans, Vito Genovese and Frank Costello out of New York, and the aforementioned Al Capone, who he met during Prohibition. While he was in power in line with the truest principles of omerta, his memory would conveniently fail him when asked about his friends. Later in life, when interviewed by his family, he would only offer the following. Quote, "It was a long time ago, yes. I knew a lot of them, but I can't remember their names. I don't care who he was. We had friends every place in the United States. Everyone we had to know, we knew." End quote. As a matter of fact, I tend to think of Clyde as someone similar to a Frank Costello type within the Colorado underworld. He was certainly tough, but more often than not, he used his brain to make money and advance his interests by knowing and influencing the right people. Now, the last thing I'll say about Clyde is that he was known to have a big heart. Over the years, the Smaldones, as a family and an organization, were known to have helped out many families in need. They gave coal and groceries to many North Denver neighbors, went to bat with police when neighborhood kids ran afoul of the law, donated large sums of money specifically to the local Catholic Church and other community projects, and even raised money to help build a local high school. Similar to what you'll hear in other mob-run communities during this time, it's clear that the Smaldones took care of their neighborhood, and a large part of the local community saw them as Robin Hood-type figures, though a large part of the law enforcement hated them. Clyde would be quoted as saying the following. Quote, "Anybody that we heard that needed something, they could come and they'd get money. We'd get them food. We bought truckloads of food to the orphans." End quote. Okay, so before we jump back into the chronological timeline of the Smaldone era, let's quickly jump over to talk about the other key brother, Eugene Checkers Smaldone. Checkers, as he would come to be known, would allegedly receive his nickname due to his wizardry at that game, for which he'd allegedly won several city tournaments as a youth, and the nickname stuck for the remainder of his life. As far as personalities go, though, the two brothers were very different. Checkers was younger than Clyde by 4 years, and many would describe him as not having the brains for finesse that his older brother had, but he was known to be more physically intimidating and just generally tougher. He's not a guy you wanted to piss off. While friends and police would often describe Clyde with words like gentleman, they'd often refer to Checkers as mean, though some in law enforcement thought him to be more like a schoolteacher type. So there were perspectives on both sides, but of the two, he was definitely the tougher one, and you'll see that. Checkers rang up his first arrest at the age of 15 in 1925 when he was caught stealing automobile accessories. A year later, he'd be arrested again for going on an amazing car theft spree of stealing, get this, 25 cars in just 10 days. That sounds like a lot to me. Obviously, I don't know much about car theft, but 25 cars in 10 days? Good Lord. In the early days, he'd also be arrested for bootlegging, attacking a police officer, reckless driving, stealing merchandise from local stores, and for assaulting a police informant during an illicit liquor delivery. By the time it was all said and done, his criminal record would stretch over 7 decades, and though he'd be a suspect in several murders, he was never actually convicted of killing anyone. During the Smaldone era, Checkers was the one brother most closely aligned to the Pueblo LCN, and the brother who over time had the tightest connections in general to the Mafia. He was very close to Pueblo mob leader Charlie Blanda, and the pair would often go gambling, drinking, and they took hunting and fishing trips together. From the 1920s well into the 1960s, Checkers would work closely with Clyde, though eventually, through a series of events, the brothers, and we'll talk about this, would have a falling out. But that's a 40-year partnership. And a lot of the description I just provided makes Checkers seem like kind of a bad dude. But don't forget that he also had a big part in taking care of the local community. And there was even an infamous story of him saving a little girl, the warden's niece, from when he did time in prison, and another child. He saved them from being kidnapped as part of a planned prison break by other inmates, something that they were working on and he found out about. As the story goes, Checkers faced down a prisoner who, during the breakout, had pointed a gun directly in his face, uttering the words, and I quote, "Take that thing out of my face," end quote, and then locked himself in a room and, of course, played checkers with the two kids in turn until the danger was over. So talk about a real Clint Eastwood type moment. Tough, balls of steel right there. If that's not showing toughness, heart, and courage, I don't know what does. Anyhow, there are other brothers who we'll cover in a bit, but let's go ahead and jump back into the timeline. So if you remember, the brothers Clyde and Eugene would be released from Leavenworth and would return home to Denver in 1934, but by that point, things had changed. Prohibition was over, and the brothers would be left kind of looking for a way to make money. It wouldn't take them long. Similar to other mobs around the country, gambling presented itself as a major potential source of revenue, and the brothers would jump in headfirst. Their first move would be to partner with a man named Elijah Smiling Charlie Stevens, who was known as a gambling kingpin in the Denver area from the 1930s into the 1950s. So pretty famous dude in Denver when it came to gambling. He's the guy you need to know. At the time, Smiling Charlie Stevens was running a popular restaurant and casino with a local gambler named Leo Barnes. The Smaldones were in partnership with Stevens overseeing the gambling on the casino side. They would begin to make good money, and gambling would go on to be the Smaldones' primary source of revenue for the next several decades. So I think they found their niche right here and then. The partnership between Stevens and Barnes was extremely volatile, and in the end they'd have a falling out and dissolve the partnerships shortly after Barnes had tried to take more control over the restaurant that they owned, which was the Blakeland. He wanted to take a higher degree of control and kind of muscle in on the operations. The venue was ultimately closed in 1936 after receiving complaints from local religious leaders about the gambling. In the end, the Stevens-Barnes affair would end in an assassination attempt that would get the Smaldone brothers embroiled again in some serious legal trouble. According to the book Smaldone, The Untold Story of an American Crime Family, quote, just before 7 p.m. on December 8, 1936, the diminutive gambler and his wife Perny climbed into their 1935 Ford sedan on the 1000 block of Grant Street near downtown. When Barnes hit the starter, a massive black powder explosion demolished the sedan. The explosion was so violent it drove a large piece of the windshield 15 feet up the trunk of a nearby tree and scattered car parts in a 100-foot radius. Miraculously, Perny, who was blown out of the passenger side door she was about to shut, received only cuts and bruises. Leo wasn't so lucky. The charge, placed under the driver's side, drove him through the car's roof, tore away part of his left buttocks, and broke his pelvis. End quote. Despite their denials, Smiling Charlie Stevens, Clyde, and Checker Smaldone, as well as another man, would be arrested and charged with conspiracy. There were 2 alleged witnesses to the bombing. First, a woman who knew Checkers told police she saw men tampering with the car just before the explosion. And then there was a patrolman who told investigators that he had observed Clyde making a call from a neighborhood phone booth just minutes before the bomb went off. On April 19, 1937, Stevens, Clyde, and Checkers Smaldone would be convicted of assault with attempt to murder and conspiracy to murder. As a result of this incident, Stevens, Clyde, and Checkers each got 7 to 10 years in the state penitentiary for conspiracy to commit murder. Unfortunately for Clyde, that very same day, he'd also be sentenced to 4 to 6 years for his part in, of all things, a $450 robbery of a cigarette, candy, and popcorn truck in Canyon City, Colorado. In both cases, the Smaldones, as they would throughout their lives, they would deny any involvement, and as you'll see during the rest of the video, I think there's a fine line between things that they actually did versus overzealous prosecution and sentences handed out by the government that had it in for them. In reality, the truth is probably somewhere in between, as I'm sure they had a hand in some pretty unsavory things over the years, but as you'll see later on, there was clearly a bias against them from a law enforcement perspective. And so again, Clyde would go off to do his time in the state penitentiary in 1938, while Checkers and Stevens would go away in 1939 after a series of failed appeals. And unfortunately, Clyde was in prison in 1938 when his father, Raphael, would pass away, and the real gut shot was that the warden, with whom Clyde had a very poor relationship, would not grant him a release to attend his father's funeral. Can't even imagine what that must have been like. Clyde would ultimately be paroled from Canyon City on December 24th, so just a day before Christmas, after serving 4 years and 5 months when he received a pardon from his good friend, influential Governor Ralph Carr. It was just another instance of the power of his influential relationships paying off. In January of 1943, just 3 weeks after Clyde, Eugene Checkers Smaldone was paroled and immediately jumped in with his brother to help run and expand their gambling empire. The brothers would go to work for their mother, Mamie, who at the time owned a struggling establishment called the Tijan Bar and Cafe on 3740 Tijan Street, which the family owned before the more famous Gaetanos. The restaurant and bar, unfortunately, at the time was not doing well. They were making only $20 per day. But with Clyde's instincts and connection, as well as the knowledge that with World War II in full swing by that point, there was big money to be made on the black market. The Tijan Bar and Cafe was the perfect place to revitalize his career and, of course, make more money just outside the law. In addition to running the Tijan Bar and Cafe, Clyde Smaldone began to enterprise, getting into lucrative slot machines, beginning to dive full force into sports parlay betting cards, which were coming into fashion around that time, and they would also partake in more traditional mob rackets, including bookmaking and loan sharking. By Clyde's account, in later years, the Smaldones had successfully placed as many as 585 slot machines in drugstores, bars, and clubs all over the state of Colorado, which were made legal by purchasing a $100 federal tax stamp, so a nice little loophole. The Smaldones would also begin to run nightly dice games, most specifically a game called Bar Booth or Barbit, across Metro Denver or Pueblo. This dice game, which was similar to craps except that there was no house and players played against each other, was a staple in the Italian community that was brought over from the old country. When players ran out of money, of course, the Smaldone Sharks were there to grant loans at exorbitant interest rates. And through all of these activities, literal rivers of cash started to flow into the organization. This is the point where the cash really begins to accumulate for the Smaldone brothers, and they become rich. According to Clyde's sons, they'd often observe their father digging through his pockets and extracting fat rolls of money at the end of each workday. Here's what Clyde's son Chuck was able to recall years later as told in the book Smaldone, The Untold Story of an American Crime Family. Quote, "He had different pockets, different accounts. This would be gambling money, this would be loan money, and he'd set them down on the table and in different piles, and there was always a big wad, sometimes $4, $5, $6, $7,000, maybe more." End quote. To put that in perspective, that's approximately $49,000 to $79,000. Imagine pulling that out of your pockets. In addition to their gambling empire, the Smaldones were wise enough to take advantage of the opportunities created by economic conditions stemming from World War II and move the family into selling rationed goods on the black market. Because everything at the time was rationed and difficult to come by, you could make a killing on the black market, and many mobsters did. Most notably, Carlo Gambino made his first million selling ration stamps during the war. From their bar on Tijan Street, the brothers would sell everything from black market liquor to simple daily items like canned goods, sugar, butter, meat, shoes, clothes, etc. However, the biggest prize was gas stamps, and the Smaldones were able to get and sell plenty of those. It's around the mid to late 1940s that between what they were doing in gambling as well as their black market operation, that the Smaldone Empire reached its zenith going into the early 1950s. This is kind of the peak. This is where they were, I would say, at their, at the top of the mountain, so to speak. It was later estimated by law enforcement that the Smaldone mob's annual revenue from gambling and loan sharking during their heyday was around $1 million per year, or the equivalent of $7 to $12 million per year in today's money. This would prove to be the organization's #1 ongoing source of income. Clyde Smaldone would famously say the following about gambling. Quote, "Once the government found out how much money there was to be made in gambling, they would get into it." End quote. That statement would prove to be prophetic in later years when most states began to legalize many forms of gambling. Always the entrepreneur, Clyde Smaldone was always looking for ways to expand the organization's gambling empire. As a result, in 1947, he identified a small mountain town called Central City, which had been seeing a revitalization of tourism and seemed ripe for gambling. In the summer months of 1947 through 1949, he and his brothers would open and run the Monte Carlo Casino, which offered craps, roulette, and slot machines, among other games, to local tourists eager to spend a buck. Due to the fact that the city was small, with little taxable income to maintain infrastructure, by the time the Smaldones came to town, the place was in relative shambles, despite the summer booms in tourism. In concert with local government officials, however, the Smaldones struck a deal to provide the financing for a new water system, restore a number of houses, and provided the backing for a lunch program for town school children in exchange for the ability to operate their gambling operation without interference from law enforcement. So they did all those good things so that the law enforcement would look the other way and everybody be happy, everybody would make money. For 3 years, the residents of Central City and the Smaldones operated harmoniously. Their operation included the Smaldones, their enforcer Paul and Ricci, and also included members of the Pueblo LCN, including Blackie Mazza. However, in 1949, the party more or less came to an end when a new law and order justice of the peace, Lowell Griffith, was elected and began applying heat to the operation. As a result, and I'm not going to cover everything because this is definitely a rabbit hole, the Smaldones would eventually pull their operations out of Central City. While they certainly turned a profit, they would later say it wasn't all great either. A grand jury in 1951 would later claim that the Smaldone brothers and each of their partners made between $25,000 and $50,000 between 1948 and 1949 just out of Central City. So that's roughly $307,000 to $615,000 in today's money just from that one enterprise. Now, when brought in for questioning, Clyde refused to answer 106 out of 108 questions put to him by the grand jury's investigators. Just as Clyde had predicted, when the state of Colorado approved state-supervised gambling, the revenue poured in. As of 2008, adjusted gross proceeds, total bets minus payouts from gambling in Central City and 2 other approved cities, topped $715 million annually. In the midst of all of this activity and success, Clyde had managed to steward the Tijan Bar and Cafe through rough times, and by 1947, it was thriving. It's at this point that he made the decision to purchase a local drugstore and meat market on the corner of West 38th Avenue and Tijan Street and turn it into an Italian restaurant that would come to be known as Gaetano's after his paternal grandfather. This restaurant would go on to become an institution in Denver and would become the primary base of operations for the Smaldone organization. A 2021 article by author Matt Masich in Colorado Life magazine provided a really nice, authentic summation of the brothers and the famous eatery and command post. Quote, "The little Italian restaurant on Northwest Denver's Tijan Street has a big reputation, and not just for authentic food. From the time Gaetano's opened in Denver's Little Italy neighborhood in 1947, everyone knew it as the mob's hangout. The restaurant owners, the Smaldone family, simply called it the place. In the 1950s and 60s, the Smaldone name was notorious in Denver, instantly recognized as the strong arm of the mob. Banner headlines across the Denver Post read, 'Smaldone brothers get 60-year terms,' and 'Verdict spells end for Smaldone gang.' Gaetano's was the crime family's headquarters, and the people hanging around the wood-paneled restaurant were a who's who of the Colorado underworld. You could find family patriarch Clyde Smaldone, Gaetano is the Italian equivalent of Clyde, seated at the bar, always at his spot furthest from the door. Clyde looked every bit the part of an Italian-American mob boss of average height and above average weight, dressed immaculately in expensive suits, and the look punctuated by an ever-present cigar. Besides his intellect, Clyde was known for his talent for making friends, whether it was with his neighbors, Mafia kings like Al Capone and Carlos Marcello, or Colorado Governor Ralph Carr. Colleagues and arresting officers alike described Clyde as a gentleman. Clyde and his younger brother Eugene, who went by Checkers, often would visit with the patrons of Gaetano's, inquiring about the food that was in the early days prepared by their mother in the restaurant's kitchen. Like a good cop, bad cop routine, Checkers was the Smaldone with the tough guy reputation. He had the closest ties to the feared mafia bosses to the south in Pueblo. But Checkers wasn't all intimidation. With a few drinks under his belt, those at the bar would hear him launch into an impromptu one-man opera performance. In later years, Clyde and Checkers were less involved in the family's racket. The youngest brother, Clarence, known as Chauncey, took over. Chauncey, the handsomest of the brothers, had a favorite spot at Gaetano's at the table in the far back, table 404, to the servers who work there today, where you'd see him eating his now famous Chauncey burger, a half-pound of ground chuck, melted mozzarella, and roasted Italian peppers, served with a side of the house red sauce. The Chauncey burger is still on the menu. From Gaetano's, the Smaldones ruled Denver from the 1930s through the 1970s. But you won't find them there anymore. The three brothers passed away over the last 2 decades, and the family sold Gaetano's 6 years ago. Still, the place is saturated with their memory. The dinner room looks the same as the last time the Smaldones remodeled in 1973, and you can sit at Clyde's favorite bar stool. Most of the patrons are local, and many of them knew the Smaldones, says Gaetano's general manager Don Knowles. 10 out of 11 of them have nothing but great things to say about the family, he said. People tell him that no one in the neighborhood ever went hungry, no matter how bad the times were. The Smaldones would always help out. That's the tricky thing about figuring out the Smaldones. Depending on who you talk to, they were either modern-day Robin Hoods or shoot-'em-up mafiosos straight out of a gangster flick. In reality, they were neither. There's no doubt that the stories about their generosity are true. Even in their heyday, when the Denver Post waged a media campaign against organized crime, the newspaper's Roundup magazine gave Clyde and Checkers credit for helping destitute North Denver families with milk and groceries, secretly paying college tuition for local boys, and funding Catholic orphanages. Each Christmas, they donate quantities of athletic equipment to the homeless waifs and feed 'em good at Gaetano's, the magazine wrote. There was also a darker side to the Smaldones. No matter how you spin it, they made their money by breaking the law. First bootlegging, then running gambling rackets and loan sharking. Some of the people associated with them died violently. End quote. By this time, not only were the Smaldones operations running at full tilt, anyone in the Denver vicinity who wanted to get into gambling essentially had to get permission to do so from the Smaldone brothers, or else. They would use their power and intimidation to muscle in on many local gambling establishments, including Mountain View Club and others. Informants would claim they never put in any money, but would instead muscle in and make themselves partners in the business. Very convenient. One such example was later recounted to authorities by a confidential informant. Quote, on July 21st, 1951, confidential informant Denver T3 reported that for many years, Clyde and Eugene Smaldone, former Denver bootleggers, had been recognized as the mobsters who dominated racketeering activities in the Denver area. He related that during 1947, Denver gamblers Anthony Colasaco and John West opened a big barbit game in a barn on a farm in Henderson, Colorado, owned by Joe Priola. That this undertaking was operated for only a few days when Colasaco and West received word from Clyde and Eugene Smaldone that they were to appear at a conference at the headquarters of the Smaldones at Gaetano's restaurant in North Denver. That Colasaco and West declined this invitation and refused to confer with the Smaldones, and a few nights later, as West entered his automobile parked in downtown Denver, Smaldone enforcers Frank Mazza, Porky Rauda, and Paul Enrici, who long had been known as bodyguards and strong arm men for the Smaldones, accosted West, forced him into the automobile, and ordered him to drive out onto the Pecos Road outside of Denver. Informant related that undoubtedly these men intended to kill West, but the latter jumped out of the automobile as it was proceeding through downtown Denver streets, started screaming, and raised such a commotion that his assailants fled the scene. Informants stated a few days after this incident, Colasacco went to talk things over with the Smaldones in their office at Gaetano's restaurant, and there Clyde and Eugene Smaldone told him if he and his partner desired to continue their gambling activities at Priola's farm, it would be necessary henceforth to pay the Smaldones 50% of the gambling proceeds. This proposal was accepted by Colasacco, and gambling operations continued up until January 6, 1948, when Denver gambler Mike Falbo, aka Fats Falbo, was murdered near the scene of this gambling operation. Informant described Falbo as a tough Denver hoodlum and gambler who on frequent occasions became drunk and publicly boasted that he was going out and clean out the Smaldones' place. On the night of the murder, January 6, 1948, Falbo was at the Priola farm and lost $1,800 in the barbet game in session there, whereupon he picked an argument with Eugene Smaldone, who was participating in this game, and berated Smaldone as a chiseler, and at the height of the argument reached out and jerked Smaldone's hat brim down over his face. Eugene Smaldone thereupon jerked Falbo's hat from his head, threw it on the floor, and stated, "Fats, you have just signed your death warrant." End quote. In January of 1948, Mike Fats Falbo, age 30, was found hanging out of the blood-spattered passenger side door of his vehicle, which had crashed into a roadside ditch in Adams County, which is just north of Denver, Colorado. In addition to being shot in the head 3 times, he'd been beaten and stabbed in the face numerous times. So in the face! Though 17 suspects were arrested, including Smaldone organization members John Porky Rauda and Frank Blackie Mazza, nobody was ever convicted of the slaying. This incident just goes to show that although the brothers weren't true Cosa Nostra, they weren't afraid to whack people out when needed. Though again, I'd point out that the Smaldones were never convicted of any murders, but this wouldn't be the last time that their names would be in the discussion after a gangland murder took place. In fact, 2 years later, in February of 1950, Falbo's good friend, Harold Murph Cohen, age 37, was found by 2 young boys under 5 feet of water near the shoreline of Blue Lake, which is now Coors Lake, which is near West 44th Avenue and McIntyre Street in rural Jefferson County. His hands and feet, and this is ruthless, by the way, his hands and feet were secured with wire and a rope holding 60 pounds of railroad iron to his body and a large rock lashed to his midsection. And according to autopsy reports, this is where it gets truly heinous. Cohen was alive, though he may not have been conscious when he was put into the lake. He had been missing for 3 months. The Smaldone organization was suspected, but no one was convicted of either murder. However, the brothers' success was a double-edged sword, and the empire they'd built would begin to unravel very soon after this. In the early 1950s, the Smaldone brothers would begin to increasingly draw the ire of authorities, and it would eventually lead to the slow downfall of their organization. In July of 1950, the United States Senate would identify the Smaldones as well as their contemporaries as the men in control over the underworld in Colorado, shining a major national spotlight on the 2 gangs operating in northern and southern Colorado, which of course was not good at all. That's not what you want. That's not the attention that you want. Then, in 1951, the Smaldones would draw the attention of 2 crusading, law and order type attorneys who'd just been elevated to key positions in the Colorado law enforcement space. One of these men, a former lawyer named Charles S. Vigil, had been appointed as the U.S. District Attorney for Colorado in 1951 by President Harry Truman, who of course was himself famously mobbed up and who, as we mentioned, was an acquaintance of none other than Clyde Smaldone. And the other man was former lawyer Max Melville, who was serving as Colorado's Deputy Attorney General at the time. These 2 lawmen, Vigil and Melville, would become part of what became known as the Colorado Crime Commission, known locally as Little Kefauver after the infamous Kefauver hearings of the time, which Governor Dan Thornton put together in 1951. and they would work together to really hammer the Smaldone organization from multiple angles, leveraging partnerships with federal, state, and local law enforcement. Similar to the approach from law enforcement against Al Capone in Chicago, Vigil and Melville decided to focus on the angle of evasion of state income taxes and began working to catch the brothers and members of their organization within that dragnet versus focusing on their more obvious crimes. They would get their first victory in 1951 when Smaldone associates Frank Blackie Mazza and Paul Enrici were convicted of evasion of state income taxes. While testifying for Mazza during his trial, Clyde Smaldone clearly agitated, and you're going to see Clyde or Checkers, they did not like photographers, snapped on a Denver Post photographer taking pictures outside the courtroom, snarling the following, quote, "The next time you shoot my picture, I'm going to punch you in the nose," end quote. Lucky for Clyde, his lawyers stopped him before the incident could really proceed any further. Though from the information I saw, Clyde had his fist cocked and ready, and he was about to deck that photographer. Now, it's around this time frame that he got the nickname Flip Flop, which was created by the local press, whom he'd historically disdained. And as a matter of fact, he really hated that nickname and was never quite sure where the newspapers got it from. None of his friends dared call him that. Now, around this same time, in 1951, Clyde and Checkers Smaldone were called before a Denver grand jury investigation on gambling led by Melville, where, as previously mentioned, both men pled the fifth over 100 times, essentially refusing to provide anything but name and address. Now, in early 1952, and it's just going to kind of keep building from here, Vigil would keep up the pressure when two law enforcement officials, so this is indirectly hitting at the Smaldones, were indicted for lying about payoffs they received to ignore gambling in their respective counties. Additionally, the issue of the Smaldones' relationships with local politicians and police, especially in Central City, were called into question. In November of 1952, in a somewhat calculated move to irritate Clyde and Checkers, Vigil would force the Smaldone brothers to pay their $1,000 fines, dating all the way back to their 1933 bootlegging convictions, almost a full 20 years later. Kind of a petty move, but if you're looking to get under their skin, that's a good way to do it. But then came the legal blow that would stop the brothers in their tracks and would lay the foundation for the long-term decline of the family's power. And it would start off, in my opinion, from a legal perspective, pretty innocuously. It would go in a direction that they did not expect. On January 14th, 1953, Clyde and Checkers Smaldone, along with Blackie Mazza and Paul Enrici, would be indicted on charges of selling gambling apparatus without notifying the government, a charge which carries a 2-year prison sentence and a $5,000 fine. Now, additionally, Clyde would also get a charge of making false statements to federal agents about the number of slot machines he owned, while Checkers Smaldone, and this would end up being the big one, would be indicted on charges of failure to pay $5,000 in income tax in 1946, which would be the charge that would come back to bite the brothers in the ass. Now, again, the income tax charge, this is at about, I think this is about 7 years. And what do you have to do? Keep your taxes for the last 7 years. They can be audited. So this is literally at the edge of that range of being audited and having your taxes called into question. And for all you tax lawyers out there, please tell me if I'm wrong. But again, this seems at first like a bit of a reach. To keep up the pressure, in February of 1953, Clyde, Eugene, and 29 associates would be hauled into court over an allegedly fixed dice game at a pool hall on 7057 Federal Boulevard. The government would attempt to seek conviction charges of being habitual criminals, so I guess kind of a serious charge. A witness in the case testified he was told the Smaldones would literally blow up the pool hall if he snitched about the fixed games. In the end, in this case, the government wasn't able to pin anything major on them, but they'd ultimately plead out to a simple charge of gambling, with each man paying a $100.50 fine and $8.81, better get that 81 cents, in court costs. But again, this is not a good look, with, a witness telling the public that you're threatening to blow up a building if things don't go your way. Not a good look. However, as I said, the pressure would keep up, and in their next legal battle, and kind of unexpected, they would not be so lucky. On June 2nd, 1953, Checkers went on trial for failure to pay $5,000 in income taxes in 1946. Now, when you consider the fact, and again, I'm not a tax expert, but you have to keep your taxes for 7 years, right? And after that, they can't be called into question by the government. So this is right at that 7-year line, which sounds to me like a major reach, when you have to go that far back. Not saying that it wasn't true that he didn't pay his income taxes, but again, that's going right to the limit, essentially. The trial, of course, was contentious from the get-go, with the judge accusing Checkers Smaldone of using the old Mafia go-to of feigning illness, and the judge was pretty upset, to be quite honest, and really called him to the carpet. And in fact, Checkers actually did have a very real appendectomy. Of course, he had, just so coincidentally happened to have a case of appendicitis and had to have an actual appendectomy done literally right at the beginning of this trial. So coincidence, right? But I could see where the judge would think that he's trying to subvert the legal process. Ultimately, the trial would be dismissed after a verdict was unable to be reached, with a new trial being scheduled for September of 1953. And this is where things get really, really bad for the brothers. You see, as the trial was going on, there were also rumors based on testimony coming out of a federal grand jury that members of the organization had attempted to bribe jurors in Checkers' first tax evasion trial, to which the accused would plead innocent. As a result, Checkers' second trial, which was going on now by this time, was immediately postponed as soon as this information came out. And then summarily, Clyde Smaldone, as well as several associates of the family, including actual blood family members, his cousin Luis Smaldone, his uncle, their uncle Fiore Fat Smaldone, as well as Michael and Jerry Bonallo Jr. and William Willie Cavalrisi, were all brought in and arrested on charges of conspiracy related to this testimony that was coming out of this grand jury. So in October of 1953, the Smaldone brothers would surprise everybody, including their co-defendants, by making what would prove to be a pretty fateful decision to plead out, essentially to plead guilty to those two charges of conspiracy, after essentially pleading not guilty earlier in the month. And apparently during the proceedings, both Smaldone brothers attempted to rough up, and again, they don't like photographers, attempted to rough up some photographers after entering the federal building. And like I said before, they're doing things at this point in time publicly that are just not a good look. So the decision to plead out and to plead guilty was certainly a gamble. And if I'm a co-defendant, I'm probably a little bit ticked off that they pled guilty ahead of the trial, because the co-defendants in this case still had to go on trial for 13 counts of jury tampering, and the witness testimony, which would be forthcoming, did not come off well for the Smaldone brothers and their compatriots. The brothers' hope was that the jury would be fair-minded, but the reality was the government wanted to hammer the brothers, and everything that they were doing pretty much just put everything in a position where there was almost no way that they were going to come off well in this trial. In the end, all 5 defendants were found guilty on a total of 33 counts on October 30th, 1953, and of course, both Clyde and Checkers pled guilty of their 2 counts of conspiracy, and then 3 counts each of offering bribes and obstructing justice, meaning their plea, in reality, really didn't work out all that well for anybody. Now, the sentences that would ultimately be handed out for the jury tampering and conspiracy quite honestly, in my very novice legal opinion, were quite simply nothing less than shocking. So a month later, on November 23rd, 1953, Judge Willis W. Ritter, who was known for making some pretty eccentric and bizarre rulings over the years, went with the hammer, and he sentenced both Clyde and Checker Smaldone to an astonishing 60 years in prison, which at their age at the time was essentially a life sentence. So talk about being about as harsh as you could be, and sentencing them to probably well above the maximum guidelines, or right at the top of the guidelines. Pretty crazy. Now, papers at the time would laud the victory, but would also notate, and this is important, a rift between the judge in the case and law enforcement, specifically federal law enforcement, with the Greeley Daily Tribune relating the following. Quote, 2 Smaldones each given 60-year terms. Judge denounces U.S. Attorney General and FBI for laxity in investigation of jury tampering. Denver, Colorado. The gambling Smaldone brothers, Eugene and Clyde, were each sentenced to 60 years in federal prison Monday by U.S. Judge Willis W. Ritter. They had been convicted of a charge of jury tampering. In pronouncing sentences, Judge Ritter charged that the U.S. Attorney General and Federal Bureau of Investigation had refused to assist in the jury tampering investigation which smashed the Smaldone gang. Cracks at Department of Justice. I don't understand why the Department of Justice, which is charged with law enforcement, should refuse to assist in the investigation of jury tampering in the Smaldone cases, but they did, Judge Ritter said. Only through the efforts of the Treasury Department and the use of their agents was the investigation carried on to a successful conclusion. At the point where the inquiry began about jury tampering, the Attorney General of the United States advised the U.S. Attorney for Colorado that the FBI would not participate in the investigation. 3 others get shorter terms. 3 fellow defendants of the Smaldones drew lighter sentences. William Cavalrisi, DuPont Tavern operator, and Jerry Bonallo Jr. were sentenced to 15 years imprisonment each, and Michael Bonallo of Wheat Ridge to 10 years. Clyde Smaldone, as he was hustled into a U.S. Marshals van for the return trip to the county jail, yelled an epithet at a Denver Post photographer. His brother lighted a cigar as officers led him handcuffed from the courtroom and sent up clouds of smoke. Wives of the Smaldone brothers fought back tears as they talked to their husbands through bars of the detention cell. Federal agents said the heavy sentences levied against the brothers brought to an end a gambling empire which at one time grossed millions of dollars in slot machines, racetrack betting, and other illegal operations. End quote. Now, you would think that the brothers' story would end there because they just got hammered. and not in the sense getting hammered that you want, right? They got really nailed from a legal perspective, but it seems that they actually would have a bit of luck on their side, though I'm sure that day was a pretty dark day in both of their lives. 13 months after they went away, Judge Ritter's decision would actually be thrown out after the sentences would be ruled as excessive by the U.S. Supreme Court. So remember, I mentioned that there was certainly a rift, and that rift proved to be the lucky thing that helped the brothers get a second trial. So the brothers would receive a new trial. Now, at this trial, Clyde and Eugene pretty much took the same approach, and they worked with the judge in the case to plead guilty to lesser tampering charges. And on August 20th, 1965, they were resentenced to just 12 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. So still a lot of time, of course, but not as bad as a 60-year sentence that they had been stuck with. But if you think back about it, even with the reduction in prison time and the fine, the brothers would still end up feeling as if they'd been double-crossed by the legal system, and would maintain over the years that they had not participated in any jury tampering of any kind, especially Clyde. And, if I'm Eugene and I think back, God, I could have just paid the $5,000, and then you get nailed with a fine that's double what you could have paid, plus the 60 years, even though it turned out to be 12. Hindsight truly 2020 in this case. I bet he wished he had played his cards a little bit differently. So, as I said, Eugene's simple issue with back taxes of $5,000 would turn itself into first the ridiculous sentence of 60 years, but finally the 12 years and a $10,000 sentence. After this final resolution of the case, the pair would do their second stints at USP Leavenworth. However, at this point, the damage was done, as the two brothers who built the empire together, the Smaldone Empire together, would eventually have a falling out, and this was the situation that was the direct cause of their issue. The pair would do around 9.5 of their 12-year sentence and would be released in 1962, which we'll cover a little bit later. And Clyde was never able to forgive his younger brother, whose fault it essentially was that they wound up in prison. He would say the following in an interview later on in his life. Quote, "We went to jail. That beloved brother of mine, Checkers, I spent my money and I asked him to pay me the money I spent. I done 9.5 years of my life for him. He won't pay me the money he owes me. If you call that a good brother, and not only me. The other 6-7 guys that tried to help him, some of them had to hawk their house, some of them lost business, lost their jobs, and to this day, he's never given one of them guys a quarter, like he didn't me. And I was his brother. A lot of times I got to thinking, because I wasn't guilty of really, really being involved, my brother, I shouldn't have even tried to help him because he's a no-good SOB." End quote. With Clyde and Checkers away, the family needed someone to step up in order for them to maintain their grip on Denver's underworld. Enter the youngest brother, Clarence Chauncey Smaldone. Chauncey, as his friends and family called him, was born on February 8, 1924, and was the youngest of the 11 children born to Raphael and Mamie Smaldone. He would be the 6th boy in the family and was almost a full 2 decades younger than his oldest brother and the family's leader, Clyde. According to Smaldone, the untold story of an American crime family, Chauncey was dead on the best looking of the brothers, was much taller than his siblings at 6 feet tall, and was blessed with a full head of wavy hair and piercing dark eyes, which got him quite a bit of attention from the young Italian girls in his neighborhood. He was said to have bore a striking resemblance to a young Dean Martin. As a young child, Chauncey roamed the neighborhoods in North Denver with another young Italian youth named Paulie Villano, who was in fact his cousin, despite only a 4-year age difference. These two young lads were nearly inseparable, with the Villano family living just a few houses down the street from the Smaldone family. Chauncey would go on to serve in the Army during World War II, serving time in the South Pacific Theater. And after the war, he returned home to Denver and moved in with his wife and 2 children into an apartment directly above Gaetano's, beginning work first at a filling station that he and Paulie Villano owned at West 46th Avenue and Pico Street. Occasionally, Chauncey would work the bar at Gaetano's, and his nephew Paulie would eventually find his forte, which was running the restaurant for the family. Now let's talk about Paulie for just a moment. So he was definitely would become an important member of the family as well. So Paul Clyde Villano, who came to be known as Fat Paulie, and just a side note, and I say this facetiously, mob nicknames have zero time for gangsters with body image issues. I find that funny. Everybody's fat this, fat that. Well, man, if you don't want to be known as the fat guy, well, that's tough. You get stuck with that fat moniker your whole life. So Paulie was born in 1928 to the eldest Smaldone's sister, Corinne. Friends would recall him as a terrific tap dancer in his youth, and he would become a champion gymnast in high school, as well as a scholarship athlete at the University of Colorado, though he would eventually put on the weight that later gave him his nickname, of course, as he got older. Paulie, who never married and remained a bachelor his entire life, was said to be a ladies' man, and was always up for a good time, regularly spending freely on alcohol, beautiful women, and taking frequent trips to Las Vegas to partake in all of those things. Like his uncle Clyde, Paulie had a gift for storytelling and was generally considered to be charming and really loved pranks. Now, outside of being a general party animal, Paulie was also known to be both smart and well educated, able to talk about subjects that would go over the heads of many other toughs who entered the life, as they should say. In the relationship between Chauncey and Paulie, it was often said that the latter, Paulie, had the brains, so to speak. And so it wasn't long after the war that both Chauncey and Paulie joined Clyde and Checkers Smaldone in the family business, getting deep into gambling and sports parlay cards. In 1956, at age 32, Chauncey would be arrested for the first time on a gambling charge when he and 7 others were busted at a house on 3357 Navajo Street for running an illegal bar booth game. And this wouldn't be his last arrest, as he'd continue to ring up gambling pinches and acquittals throughout the 1960s and 1970s, which we're going to cover in great depth, though he would do a few stints in prison here and there and pay some fines. He'd really be kind of, in and out from this point without really doing too much major time during the 60s and the 70s. Paulie, in addition to running Gaetanos, would also get into bookmaking, where his reputation was pretty flawless, meaning that when he won, he collected, but when he lost, he paid pretty quickly. So, of course, that made it really easy for customers to trust him. With Checkers and Clyde gone, it was Chauncey and Paulie who ran the family's operations, and they kind of kept their arms around things. And it was generally understood in the Denver underworld that they were in charge, and they did their best to hold things together for the family until the 2 older brothers got out of prison. These two would begin to shift the organization's focus away from dice gaming and more towards parlay betting cards focused on baseball, college basketball, as well as football, as the popularity of those sports grew, making it a really important revenue stream, growing revenue stream at the time. And the pair would do business with small-time gamblers, but would also be able to work with higher stakes players as well. So they were pretty much a come one and all to place your bets. They can handle both the low end and the high end players. All of these enterprises also played well into their other stream of income, which of course was loan sharking. And loan sharking, if you know anything about the mob and about gambling in general, loan sharking is a service that pretty much goes hand in hand with nearly any gambling enterprise. And the duo would have a lot of money on the street, as they say in the underworld, which would pull in a fairly good amount of revenue for the Smaldone organization. In 1959, informants would indicate that Chauncey, along with Paulie and Joe the Ram Salardino, a great nickname by the way, were essentially fleecing Denver businessmen out of thousands of dollars at a gambling club known as the Thorn Lake Club, located in Gilpin County, Colorado. The club itself featured roulette, blackjack, and crap games, and as a result of this information sort of making its way out, the authorities were able to conduct successful raids on the club, and they arrested Clarence, they arrested Paulie, and of course they arrested Joe the Ram. Again, this wouldn't be the last time they'd be arrested. And then fast forward to November of 1962, and Clyde and Checkers Smaldone would finally get out of prison after serving 9.5 of their 12-year sentence. By this point in time, though, like I said, the brothers had had their falling out, and the 40-year partnership was more or less over. And this is where the family really kind of splits into 2 factions. Though they were never in direct conflict, the relationship would really just never be the same. Upon leaving prison, Clyde, ever the shrewdest brother of the bunch, saw which way the wind was blowing when it came to the law enforcement scrutiny, and made his move to retire from active family participation. This is essentially why I referred to him as a Frank Costello-esque figure in earlier on in the episode, because these 2 men were very similar. Frank at the time, now different circumstances, but it's just a situation where he also saw which way the wind was blowing and decided, all right, time for me to move on. And if you consider the fact that, in the 60s, you had the Kennedy administration, you eventually had Joe Valachi, more visibility, the FBI beginning to take, Cosa Nostra and the mobs a little bit more seriously. It was a good time to cut your losses and get out. Now, while the brothers were in prison, the 1957 Appalachian raid had occurred, along with many congressional hearings, probably like 3 years in the late 50s worth of hearings led by Bobby Kennedy on organized crime. And law enforcement scrutiny was beginning to significantly ratchet up the heat, like I said, with the Kennedy administration leading governmental efforts to take down the mob across the country. And though they weren't true Cosa Nostra, the Smaldones by that time certainly qualified as a mob-style enterprise. So in Colorado, they were target number one to take down. Clyde, by this time, was nearing 60 years of age, and he quickly recognized the fact that the law enforcement landscape had essentially changed, and the FBI, in cooperation with local police, were cracking down on interstate gambling and devoting more resources to fighting organized crime. Wiretaps were becoming far more common, and crimes that had previously resulted in just 90-day jail sentences, pretty light sentences, were more often than not leading to several years in prison. And of course, if you started to get into bigger things like drug pinches, which again, the Smaldones weren't directly involved in drugs, but when you started to think about things that used to result in light sentences, those were now resulting in many years in prison. So, definitely more impactful sentences. And when sentences start to be more harsh, rats start to happen, informants start to happen, and you start to have a problem. Clyde's son, Gene, would recall the following about his father years after the fact. Quote, "My dad was smart. He used to tell Chauncey and Polly, he told them, they are setting you up. They know what you guys are doing. They wouldn't listen to Dad, partly because he was drinking, and partly because they didn't want to. He didn't have as much control anymore." End quote. Even with the revelation on Clyde's part, he wasn't all out right away. Now, in October of 1967, Clyde and several of his associates, including Eugene's son, were arrested on gambling charges for running a $100,000 a week bookmaking operation. So he was back up kind of in running, but he was on his last legs, so to speak, with his criminal involvement. Now, that $100,000 a week bookmaking operation, that is worth, in terms of modern money, $1.1 million per week. So you add it up, that's $52 to $53 million per year in revenue. And, that's a lot of money. That's a huge revenue stream to just spin up. Now, while the group was doing 6 months in jail for those charges, there were reports, of course, that came out, and this is going to remind you of Goodfellas. There were reports that came out in the Rocky Mountain News before the Smaldones were released on bond, claiming that their prison time was hardly hard time. Now, quoting the Rocky Mountain News, various reports claimed they were being allowed the run of the jail, had a deputy sheriff preparing hot sandwiches for them on request, and were using a jail telephone to make calls. Now, as I mentioned above, after his semi-retirement, Clyde's drinking would become pretty problematic, so much so that his sons would put him in alcohol rehabilitation on several occasions throughout the rest of his life until he was finally able to kick the habit, which wouldn't actually happen until much later in his life. So at this point in time in the 1960s, it's a growing area of concern. Clyde's alcoholism, along with the fact that many in the family weren't ready to believe that their heyday had indeed passed, essentially led to a changing of the guard as he became more distant from the Smaldone organization, and his opinions tended to be listened to less and less often. Now, this development essentially made 53-year-old Eugene Checkers Smaldone the new de facto leader of the Smaldone family. Checkers was clearly, even though, he looked like a school teacher, the most pugnacious and probably the biggest gangster out of the three brothers. But by this time, he really was no longer the dominating figure he'd once been before going away to prison. As for Chauncey and Polly, they also ignored Clyde's warning. After all, at ages 39 and 35, it probably was a little too late to choose another career. Checkers Smaldone, time at the top, would not go without bloodshed, and it's around this time the Smaldone family will run into another legal problem, this time in relation to Eugene's son. Now, in August of 1962, Eugene's son, who also was named Eugene, was arrested and charged with interstate transportation in aid of racketeering in connection with his bookmaking activities. Now, I won't get too far into it, but the younger Eugene was in severe disfavor pretty much with the entire rest of the family due to his drug use, and also for tossing around the family name to kind of get his way, so to speak, in underworld dealings. And this was a real case of nepotism. Think of, if you're familiar with The Sopranos, think of Jackie Aprile Jr., right? Playing the gangster. Now, others in the family tried to warn Checkers, but of course, the father had a major blind spot for the dealings of his son, a fact which, as I said, rankled many within the organization. It was nepotism at its finest. Aside from the charges, the bigger issue for the Smaldones was that the younger Smaldone had been arrested with a local hood and mob novice named Robin Roberts, who was known in the street as Walkie Talkie for his habit of being a compulsive talker, loudmouth, and a person who generally liked to horn in on people's conversations. Now, I feel like we all know somebody like that, but if you're trying to be a gangster, this is not something you want to be known for. And at that time, Walkie Talkie had been developing quite a bad reputation for himself. A small-time gambler of modest means, Roberts had registered several arrests for gambling as well as extortion. In addition, he was known as a man who regularly failed to pay his gambling debts. Again, not things you want to be known for. For someone trying to rise in the underworld, this is not a good trend. And by themselves, each one of those things by themselves could lead a person into big trouble with the mob. But Walkie Talkie had another problem, an even bigger problem. He was rumored to be a confidential informant. Now, unfortunately, during the trial in which both he, Walkie Talkie, and Eugene Smaldone were co-defendants, his fate would pretty much be sealed when Denver detective Dwayne Red Borden, an organized crime investigator who essentially dogged the Smaldones for years, took the stand to testify and was forced to reveal and confirm that Roberts was, in fact, his informant. Eugene Smaldone, as a result, would plead guilty and would end up doing a year in prison. Now, retired Denver police captain Jerry Kennedy would later recall running into Roberts, who knew he had a major problem, just days after the devastating revelation. Quote, "I ran into Walkie Talkie a day or two later in that theater bar on 16th and Glenarm, doing a routine check, and I said, 'How are you doing, Walkie?' He says, 'Hey, Kennedy, they're going to kill me.' I said, 'Walkie, they're not going to kill you.' He says, 'Hey, I'm telling you, Borden named me on the stand. They're going to kill me.' Kennedy offered Roberts protection, which he declined. By God, within 24 hours, they found this guy's body. My heart sunk into my stomach." End quote. On August 7th, 1963, the body of Robin Walkie Talkie Roberts was found lying in a ditch. He was murdered in a fairly well-to-do subdivision in Denver. He had been severely beaten, then shot 4 times in the right side of the body. Members of the Smaldone mob, including both Clyde and Checkers, were arrested and questioned in the murder, but authorities ultimately focused on a St. Louis hood named Sam Shanks, an associate of both the Smaldone family as well as the St. Louis Cosa Nostra family, who they believe had been essentially imported to whack out Roberts. However, when it goes to trial, the evidence against Shanks was pretty shaky, and he was ultimately acquitted in 1964. The arresting officer related the following about the murder. Quote, "It has been widely rumored in gambling circles that the Smaldones believe that Robbins had furnished information to police authorities concerning the bookmaking activities of Eugene Louis Smaldone, which had ultimately led to his conviction on federal gambling charges, and that Checkers Smaldone was reported to have been furious at Robbins because of this. On August 13, 1963, Captain Hindis reported that Sam Shanks had been charged with the murder of Robert Robbins and was being held without bail in the Jefferson County Jail pending trial in District Court, Golden, Colorado. He stated that Robert Shanks had established an alibi placing him in Glenwood Springs, Colorado at the time the murder was committed, but that he had been charged as an accessory after the fact. On August 16, 1963, Eugene Checkers Smaldone, Clyde George Smaldone, Michael Anthony Tomeo, and Joseph Salardino were picked up in Colorado Springs, Colorado for questioning in the Robbins murder case. Captain John Hindis of the Denver Police Department stated that all these suspects refused to answer any questions concerning the murder. End quote. And as I mentioned, the Smaldones would be in and out of court, cited for contempt, but would skate free of any charges related to the walkie-talkie homicide. So they dodged a bullet, so to speak, but the full court press from law enforcement would persist. And now get ready, because they're about to spend a lot of time in and out of court from the 1960s on. In July of 1965, Clarence Smaldone and several associates would be handed 4-month sentences for contempt for refusing to answer the questions of a Jefferson County grand jury. In November of 1965, Checkers Smaldone and his son Eugene would be arrested after a raid found evidence that over $100,000 worth of bets on college football had been placed with them in the previous week alone. In January of 1966, Chauncey was again arrested as one of 20 to 28 people brought in and charged with gambling, along with cousin Paulie Villano and associate Joseph the Ram Salardino. Again, love that nickname. Each of the men were sentenced to 180 days in jail, and during the arrest, Chauncey would be found to have $1,535 on his person. Again, that's a lot of money to be carrying around in those times, which was confiscated by authorities for back taxes owed. So that's pretty convenient. In October of 1967, again, this is it just continues. Clarence and Clyde were again arrested for their part in a $100,000 bookmaking enterprise. So they spun it up again, and Clarence was sentenced to 90 days, while Clyde's charges were actually dismissed. Now, by this time, it was regularly noted by the FBI, so even the FBI was noticing the rift, that the semi-retired Clyde and Checkers were feuding, which certainly didn't help the family operations and did not help the family in their efforts to present a united front, to combat the increased law enforcement scrutiny that they were facing. So easier to take them down from a law enforcement perspective when they're divided. To keep up the pressure, in July of 1968, the Colorado Racing Commission issued an order banning 12 persons, including Clyde, Checkers, and Chauncey Smaldone, from all dog tracks and the 2 horse tracks operating in Colorado at the time. And by the 1970s, the family was really struggling with independent bookmakers who, at this point in time, given that they're starting to lose ground, no longer recognize the Smaldones as in control of all gambling in Denver. In April of 1970, Checkers Smaldone, along with Joe the Ram, would be arrested and indicted by a grand jury and charged with assault to murder, assault with a deadly weapon, and conspiracy. Now, this all stemmed, and I'm not going to go deep into this incident, but this all stemmed from an issue in which a man named Joseph Nucci was shot and then wounded, although not fatally. And again, this was an argument and a dispute between Joseph Nucci and Checkers that pretty much went from shouting to shooting really, really quickly. Like I said before, Checkers was a gangster, and you did not want to trigger his temper. It was truly a hair trigger temper. Now, Smaldone's bond would be set at $500,000, while Salardino's was set at $300,000. The brothers would go on to be arrested several more times, and I'm not going to bore you with any more than I already have in terms of the play-by-play of all of their arrests, because, if you literally list out each and every incident, it's pretty exhausting, and even I'm exhausted just telling you. I'm sure you're pretty exhausted as an audience as well. So we're going to fast forward to July 5th, 1973. And this is the date where there's another important incident in the sphere of the Smaldone organization. And this incident would touch off a period of violence in Denver. Now, the issue wasn't with the Smaldones directly. The issue was with Chauncey's ex-wife, Pauline. And in an almost hard to fathom event, Pauline was shot twice in her driveway by an unknown assailant who escaped with a getaway driver. So that was a hit. right? That wasn't just a random thing, that was a hit. And of course, the obvious point here is that family members of mob figures were typically considered off limits. Now, I know they weren't Cosa Nostra, but typically that's kind of an off limits thing in the mob world, making this shooting and assassination attempt a major, major breach of typical protocol. Now, 3 weeks later, and again, this happened quick and it was violent. 3 weeks later, a handsome former Colorado football star was found shotgunned to death in his front driveway just a few blocks from Chauncey Smaldone's Lakewood home. And this man's name was John Skip LaGuardia. Despite being a fairly well-liked young man with a lot of potential, it's been speculated that LaGuardia was trying to essentially muscle in on the Denver gambling scene as a bookmaker and had allegedly run afoul of someone senior within the Denver underworld, allegedly calling that person an old man and saying, "I don't need you anymore." Now, people in the know have speculated over the years that the old man was none other than Checker Smaldone, not somebody you want to piss off. Other accounts have speculated that there may have actually even been a confrontation in which LaGuardia slapped Smaldone. Again, a big, big mistake. So on July 26, 1973, LaGuardia was driving home from the Alpine Inn, a hangout for gamblers and other underworld figures at 3551 Tijon Street, and according to reports, he pulled into his driveway, exited his vehicle, and began walking up the driveway to his house. It was at this point when someone lying in wait stepped out from behind the bushes and shot him directly in the face with a blast from a sawed-off 12-gauge shotgun. The assassin would leave the gun beside the body, and the weapon was found to have the serial number filed off. So definitely a hit, right? Which left the police investigating the murder to call it a professional job, going on to say the following. Quote, "Let's put it this way. They knew what they were doing. A gun like this can only be used to kill someone." End quote. A man named Ralph Pizzolatto, a close friend of LaGuardia's, who was allegedly present during the alleged altercation with Checker Smaldone that resulted in the death contract on his pal, was actually rumored to have been the shooter in this case. Now, if this is indeed true, it would certainly fit with the mob tradition of ordering a friend to kill a friend. Whether that's the case or not, Pizzolatto's time was also numbered. On January 29th, 1974, just 6 months after the LaGuardia hit, Pizzolatto was found murdered as well. His body would be discovered in the back seat of his Cadillac in a lot behind the same Alpine Inn that LaGuardia had just left 6 months earlier. Police observed that the body, left in the fetal position, showed signs of strangulation as well as a gunshot wound to the face. Now, based on information from police sources shared later with writers at the Denver Post, it was insinuated that the two murders were connected with both the attempt on the life of Pauline Smaldone, as well as the attempt by the pair to muscle in on Denver bookmaking and gambling rackets. So those things were all connected together. And so was the hit on Pauline, for that matter. And as with every other murder where the Smaldones were suspected, the two hits would never really be solved. But one thing was clear: even though the family and the entire Smaldone empire was in severe decline by this time, it was pretty clear that the brothers still had really sharp teeth, so to speak, and they were not afraid to push a button on anyone who got out of line. But by this point, as Clyde had essentially predicted when he got out of prison in the early 1960s, law enforcement would launch a full court press to take the family down. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the trio would continue to rack up dozens of gambling arrests, and the heat from law enforcement would stay with them through the remainder of their lives. Now, fast forward to August of 1981, the FBI would finally land a serious blow to the Smaldones when a bug they'd planted in a back office in Gaetano's picked up a conversation between Fat Paulie Villano, Checker Smaldone, and an associate in which they were discussing the inner workings of a silencer. This would give the feds the impetus they needed to launch a series of raids in Denver and Pueblo in which they'd confiscate the silencer, a .30 caliber carbine, 27 stacks of ammunition, 4 handguns, $50,000 in cash, and a treasure trove of valuable valuable documents. No pun intended, but this bust would give the authorities all the ammo they would need to convict Checkers Smaldone, Chauncey Smaldone, as well as Paulie Villano on charges of loan sharking, income tax evasion, as well as firearms violations. And all three would be sentenced to 10-year prison terms, which at their advancing age was akin to a life sentence. Most in the know predicted that the men, especially Checkers because he was much older, would likely die behind bars. The three men would serve their time at FMC Fort Worth, of course, the medical center, prison in Texas. Now, putting everything in proper context, I think it's accurate to say that the Smaldone organization by the 1980s, the power, was much less significant, especially after this prison sentence of the family administration. Now, with no new members being actively recruited to continue the family really had nobody to pass the baton to in order to keep things going. Now, by the 1990s, the Smaldone family, as it was constituted in its heyday, was nearing an end. The first of the trio of brothers who'd originally built the family would pass away in the early 1990s when Eugene Checkers Smaldone died of a heart attack at the age of 81 on March 10, 1992. He would be buried at the Crown Hill Cemetery in Jefferson County, Colorado. It's at this point that Clarence Chauncey Smaldone officially, I guess you can say, took over leadership of what was left of the Smaldone family, but by that point, the organization was essentially a shell of its former power. Now, fast forward through the 90s, the family's still kind of limping on, and then on January 7th, 1998, the original leader and family patriarch, Clyde Smaldone, the man who had his first brush with the law in 1920, who'd become friends with presidents and mobsters alike, and who'd spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on charitable endeavors, but also lawyers, passed away at the age of 91. He's also buried at the Crown Hill Cemetery in Jefferson County. And this really only left Chauncey and Paulie, but by this point, Chauncey was dealing with severe dementia, though he did continue to frequent Gaetano's even after the family had given up ownership of the restaurant. And after getting out of prison back in 1991, Paulie returned to Denver, but kept a low profile, dying in 2003 at the age of 76. And on October 16, 2006, the final member of the Smaldone organization passed away when Clarence Chauncey Smaldone died in hospice at the age of 82. He's buried in Mount Olivet Catholic Cemetery in Jefferson County, Colorado. His family members refused to provide any specifics about his death and declined to comment when contacted by the Rocky Mountain News. And it's clear that by this point, they just simply wanted to be left alone. And with Chauncey's death, the Smaldone crime family, which had reached the pinnacle of the Colorado underworld in the late 1940s and early 1950s, essentially came to a quiet and fairly unspectacular end. And with that, the family appears to be essentially defunct, although there have been some relatively unsubstantiated rumors that there are still a handful of family members operating various rackets in and around Denver and maybe in some of the smaller towns. Retired police captain Tom Leahy, who grew up a block from Gaetano's, said the following about the Smaldones, and based upon my research, I would have to say that his sentiments ring pretty true. Quote, "They did a lot of good in North Denver. They used to send food and coal to a woman whose husband had left her with small children. In their own way, they were gentlemen." End quote. That being said, it's also clear in my research that they did have a bad side. They did do some bad things. But I wanted every one of my listeners to see that with many in the life, everything isn't black and white, good guys and bad guys, cowboys and Indians. There are many shades of gray, and I think the Smaldones definitely fit into that mold. Like most other mobsters of their era, they did what they had to do early on to survive and prosper and grew their empire in the American way, just not on the right side of the law. And I think it's fair to say that their legacy contains both good as well as bad. And that's kind of what I'll leave it at. Now, before we move on and briefly talk about the Pueblo LCN, here are a few other members of the Smaldone organization present on the infamous family chart that we really didn't touch on too heavily during the episode. Anthony Tony Smaldone, brother and family leader, Ralph A. Smaldone, another brother and family leader, Joe the Ram Salardino, family leader, who we, of course, mentioned several times throughout the episode, Gerald Jerry Lasasso, family leader, Frank Blackie Mazza, who got a mention in the episode, key lieutenant and enforcer, Eugene Young Gene Smaldone, son of Checkers and lieutenant, family pariah for his known drug use, Michael M.T. Tomeo, key lieutenant, Fiore Fat Smaldone, the uncle of the Smaldone brothers, who was also caught up with them in the 1953 conspiracy and jury tampering situation, family member. Joseph Joe Cephalou, family member. Louis Burt Capra, family member. Michael Roxy Villano, brother of Polly Villano and family member. Alan A.D. Miller, family member, of course, with the most non-Italian name possible. Paul Enrici, who we mentioned a couple of times, family member and enforcer. And John Porky Rauda, who we also mentioned a couple of times, was family member and an enforcer. Now, there were certainly other members, but I'm not going to bore you by going through every single one. I think I've covered this in just enough detail. Okay, let's quickly touch on the Pueblo LCN before we close this episode. Okay, we're not going to spend a significant amount of time on the Pueblo faction of the Colorado mob, but what I will say is that according to my research, the true Mafia in Colorado was the group in Pueblo, meaning that this family was recognized as LCN by the Commission in New York, and as such used the same rules, structures, etc. as other LCN families. That being said, based on my research and just my observations and my opinion, it definitely appeared that the Smaldone organization in Denver was the more significant of the two groups, despite not being a true Mafia family. Now, if you think about it and you do the numbers, it kind of makes sense. The population of Denver at around 1940 was approximately 322,000, according to census records, up from 288,000 in 1930, whereas the population of Pueblo was a mere 52,000 people, despite being up from 50,000 in 1930. So it was growing, but it was still very small. So Denver had the largest population in the state, which means that anyone who controls Denver, which was the Smaldones, was essentially in the driver's seat in the Colorado underworld. Now, unlike in the 1920s and early 30s, the Smaldones and the Pueblo guys, they did not come into conflict. In fact, after the murder of Joe Roma in 1933, the Smaldones and the Pueblo Cosa Nostra family worked pretty closely together and in relative harmony until the group in Pueblo became defunct in the 1970s. The relationship was based on friendships, and the Smaldones essentially needed someone to handle the operations in southern Colorado, so they turned to their trusted friends in Pueblo. So let's talk about some of the key players. First, we're going to cover Calogero Charles, or Charlie, Blanda. The mantle of boss of the Pueblo crime family first passed to Charlie Blanda after the murder of Giuseppe Joe Roma. Charlie Blanda was born in Ames, Iowa, of all places, in 1899, but at some point would move to Colorado, where he would reside permanently. According to sources, Charlie didn't have the look of a mobster. He wore large and thick glasses, but had a stout build, standing just 5'5" and weighing close to 200 pounds, and a very long arrest record that included pinches for burglary, grand larceny, and weapons violations, and he did jail time on several occasions. In the 1950s, he'd be identified as one of the top leaders in the Colorado Mafia, and throughout that entire period, throughout my research in part one, he did show up in a lot of the articles and research that I saw. And in 1953, he'd do 3 years after an income tax evasion conviction. Over the years, he'd work with the Smaldones and members of the family to maintain a very tight grip over underworld rackets, including gambling, narcotics distribution, illegal alcohol sales, as well as the rackets related to jukeboxes and coin machines. Clyde Smaldone was said to have related the following about Blanda. Quote, Charlie Blanda was kind of a big guy in Pueblo. End quote. Blanda and Smaldone, and again, this goes to show you how tight they were so close that in fact, Blanda was the godfather to Clyde Smaldone's son. He, being Blanda, would run the Pueblo family as boss from 1933 until roughly 1953, when he would pass the mantle to Vincenzo Black Jim Coletti before he went away to do his prison sentence. And now, of course, Blanda gets out of prison, and Blanda ends up dying on February 20th, 1969 in Pueblo, Colorado, after suffering a stroke. So the next one we're going to talk about is Vincenzo Black Jim Coletti, also known and sometimes referred to as James Coletti. Blanda's immediate successor as boss, as we just mentioned, was his trusted aide, Vincenzo James Coletti, called Black Jim for his dark complexion and coal-black eyes. Coletti was born in Lucca Sicula, Sicily, Italy in 1897, and forgive me if I mispronounce that city name. He would immigrate to New York City and ring up several arrests in the New York and New Jersey area before finally deciding to move out west, settling in Pueblo, Colorado, though he'd become a naturalized citizen in February of 1920 while he was still residing in New York. Once in Pueblo, Coletti would immediately become a part of the underworld due to his familial relationship with the infamous Carlino brothers. He was their cousin, who controlled much of the Colorado bootlegging and criminal and underworld at the time. Later on, Coletti would open up a club called Club Melody in the 1940s, but outside his mob rackets, he would become most known as a prominent member of, get this, the cheese industry, and was partners in the Colorado Cheese Company with none other, and I think you're going to find this interesting, Joe Bonanno, who'd taken up residence in nearby Arizona in the 1940s. As previously mentioned, Coletti took over as boss of the Pueblo Mafia family in around 1953 after previous boss Charlie Blanda went off to prison and later retired after getting out of prison from the organized crime scene. Coletti was known for keeping a pretty low profile and confined his gambling, narcotics trafficking, and racketeering activities to southern Colorado, leaving Denver to the Smaldones. Again, they had a really good partnership. And of course, he also was an enterprising liquor store and bar owner. But his low profile would change as in 1957, Coletti attended the ill-fated Appalachian Conference in upstate New York and was one of the men that was arrested in the subsequent raid, outing him nationally as a mobster. Up until the Appalachian fiasco, Coletti had only minor arrests such as for drunkenness, vagrancy, and disorderly conduct. And though he wouldn't do any time as a result, the Appalachian arrest would be the one to raise his profile, so much so that a Life magazine article in 1967 listed him as the boss of Colorado. Now, in his later years, Coletti operated the Santa Fe Market, a small cheese, fruit, and vegetable stand in Pueblo, as well as the Holiday Inn, a restaurant and tavern, with his wife. And rather than continue the life of a hardcore mobster, he preferred really just to spend his older years taking in the sun outside his cheese store and greeting the occasional well-wisher. He retired from the family in 1972 and thereby passed the mantle of boss to Joseph Scotty Spinuzzi, and Coletti would pass away of natural causes 3 years later in 1975. Now, the last man we're going to talk about, which is Joseph Scotty Spinuzzi, probably the most interesting, and I would say out of all of the three Pueblo mobsters I'm going to cover, in my opinion, this guy was the biggest gangster and had the biggest reputation for violence in terms of the three. Now, when Coletti retired, the title of boss naturally went to Spinuzzi. So let's talk about Spinuzzi a little bit. Spinuzzi was born in 1907 in Napoleonville, Assumption Parish in Louisiana. And at some point, he makes his way to Pueblo, Colorado. Now, Spinuzzi reputedly preferred to stay low profile, but the problem that he had is that he had a pretty colorful personality and a fiery temper, and that made staying low profile pretty challenging. Spinuzzi was considered to be a relatively handsome man, approximately 5 foot 8 inches tall, with dark curly hair and dark brown eyes. John J. Conchilla Jr., again, apologies if I mispronounced that name, who was a Pueblo police officer from 1960 to 1997, would say the following about Spinuzzi. Quote, Scotty was plain old mafioso. Scotty was a mean devil. He was mean. He was a good-sized man. He'd Sunday punch you, but he could stand up and fistfight you too. He got to be low-key later in life, but this guy used to get in fights. He'd pistol whip people. End quote. Now, Scotty Spinuzzi first came to national prominence when mentioned as a mob figure in the Kefauver hearings in the early 1950s. And earlier bosses Blanda and Coletti reputedly found it pretty difficult to keep Scotty under control and felt that he would bring unwanted attention to the Colorado organization, which he did. And Spinuzzi would become involved in a vending machine business and would also own a bar called Turk's Tavern with his brother Tony Turk Spinuzzi. And as you might expect with a man of his temperament, he would have a very long history of problems with law enforcement, being charged for everything ranging from bootlegging to extortion in Las Vegas, burglary, theft, counterfeiting, income tax evasion, as well as numerous counts of gambling and bookmaking. And he and his brother Tony would be swept up in 1951 on charges of, you guessed it, federal income tax evasion for failing to pay $10,140 in income tax in 1945. The feds would confiscate Turk's Tavern, both men's bank accounts, Tony's 1951 Oldsmobile and Scotty's 1950 Cadillac, but both men would pay fines and avoid jail time. And I just want to pause there and stop and think about that. They owed $10,000 in back taxes. If you compare that to Checkers Smaldone, who only owed $5,000, the Smaldones got a 60-year sentence when Spinuzzi and his brother only had to give up their bank accounts, Cadillacs, and they avoided time. Like, that's a big difference for something where Spinuzzi actually had more due in back taxes. Pretty crazy. Spinuzzi, of course, had a very close relationship with Eugene Checker Smaldone, and the two would reportedly attend various gambling events together, along with Charlie Blanda, to make Shylock loans to participants who'd been on the losing end of bets. And as previously mentioned, Spinuzzi, along with his boss at the time, Coletti, was picked up at the 1957 Mob Summit in Appalachian, though no charges would ultimately stick against him. And you'd think that that'd be the most notorious incident of Spinuzzi's mob career, but it was not, at least locally. In 1960, Spinuzzi would be accused of murdering an African-American pianist named James Scott outside a Pueblo nightclub that Spinuzzi co-owned with Joe the Ram Salardino, and Spinuzzi would go on trial in 1962. According to documentation I found relating to the People versus Spinuzzi in 1962, the circumstances of the shooting, as communicated in court, were as follows. Quote, the deceased was a musician employed at the Five Queens Club in Pueblo, Colorado. On the night of September 15, 1960, some of his friends came to his place of employment, and an argument began between the friends of the deceased and a bartender at the club over 25 cents, which the deceased friends had put in the jukebox. The deceased became involved in the argument. Thereafter, the deceased and his friends were pushed from the club by one Ricci and one Parlato, who was the manager of the club. Outside the club, Ricci and Parlato on the one hand and the deceased on the other hand engaged in a fight. They were separated by one Watson and the fight terminated. At this time, the defendant, Spinuzzi, who had been sitting in the club with Ricci and Parlato earlier in the evening, came upon the scene outside the club. Using vile language, he ordered defendant's friends from the premises and threatened to blow their brains out. The deceased's friends left, and Spinuzzi then proceeded towards the defendant, exchanged words with him, and held a pistol about 2 feet from his head and then hit and viciously kicked him. Spinuzzi and the deceased wrestled towards the back of a station wagon parked in the area. At this point, the defendant fell backward with his head back and his hand in front of his face. Spinuzzi was on top of him as he was falling. A shot was heard. Spinuzzi arose from the body of the deceased with a gun in his hand, put the gun in his belt, and walked away. The defendant lay on the ground, mortally wounded. The autopsy revealed a bullet hole in the palm of the hand of the deceased and another in the left nostril with the bullet lodged in the brain. There were powder burns on the deceased's hand where the bullet had gone through. The bullet traveled in an upward direction from its entrance in the deceased's hand to its final resting place in his brain." End quote. Spanuzzi would ultimately be found not guilty due to insufficient evidence and would skate free of any prison time. He was arrested for gambling a few more times in the 1960s and 1970s and would become boss in 1973. However, his reign would be relatively short. In 1974, he'd get a 1-year sentence for gambling, and at the same time, the federal government would contend that he, along with the snake in the grass, Joe Bonanno, were conspiring to take over all organized crime in Colorado. But those plans would really never come to fruition, as Spanuzzi would die of natural causes on September 5th, 1975, just 2 months after his friend and former boss, Coletti. And with the deaths of Coletti and Spanuzzi, the influence of the Cosa Nostra and Pueblo faded, and that faction of the national La Cosa Nostra went defunct as well. Okay, that's it for this episode. It certainly was a long, epic episode, but again, something that I found to be very interesting and compelling, and I really wanted to share the story with my channel. If you want to read more around the Colorado mob, I have 2 books that I highly recommend. First, go get Colorado's Carlino Brothers, a bootlegging empire by Sam Carlino, who is, in fact, the grandson of the Sam Carlino, the infamous Sam Carlino, who helped build the Carlino bootlegging empire, who was, in fact, murdered in 1933. The other book that I'd recommend, which I cited several times this episode, would be Smaldone, The Untold Story of an American Crime Family by Dick Kreck, with foreword from Chuck and Gene Smaldone. 2 excellent books if you want to know everything from the beginning sort of to the end from a Colorado crime perspective. These are the 2 books to get. In addition to my other sources, I leverage these books heavily, and they are both, like I said, pretty good reads about a family that is largely unknown to many around the country. Anyhow, coming up next, we're going to be digging into maybe a biography. I'm thinking about potentially Angelo Bruno as a good subject. And then, as promised previously, I'm going back to family histories to cover the little-known Cerrito family out of California. My goal will be to tell the entire history of those families so that people get a glimpse of what the Mafia was like outside the primary hubs of New York and Chicago. Hopefully that will be of interest to viewers, since other families aren't talked about nearly as often. After that, we'll likely get back to biographies, but my goal is really to continue to mix things up and to keep up with a variety of content of different types. Now, before you go, please don't forget to subscribe so that you can continue to enjoy my content as it's released. And if you have any thoughts, please leave them in the comments on YouTube or write us a review on Apple. Lastly, feel free to check out our website at www.membersonlypodcast.com. I just redesigned it. And of course, follow me on Twitter or Facebook. I'm a little less active there, but feel free to follow me anyways. And I would just say, until next time, grazie.
Thank you for listening to the Members Only podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, please hit like and subscribe to help the channel grow. You can also listen anywhere you get your podcasts. Until next time, don't forget to keep your mouth shut.